Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Tawanda Harris, and I'm glad that you are joining in for a conversation around ways that we can reach our students, see the humanity in our students, even in a virtual space. I know that this school year is not the traditional school year that we're used to, whether we're starting in a traditional setting, face to face, whether we're starting in a blended model when which half of the days are virtual and the other half would be face to face, or we're starting in a virtual space. Either way it goes, it will be something that will be new for all of us, even in a space that we will be face to face with our students. We still have the challenge of having mass social distance and all of those things. But of course, it's all to keep us safe. So we have to be mindful of that. But we know that ultimately we long to connect with our students. So this session is centered around ways that we can find entry points into students' lives and not um, be bombarded by all of the things that we believe are obstacles, but really building on and leveraging those things. So hopefully you will get that from this session. The goal is to talk about ways that we, as the teacher, as the educator, can recenter the learner in the learning. I want to start off by thinking about this post. This was a recent post that I had posted on my Instagram page, and it reads, "I can't teach you if I don't know you." I think about Dr. Goldie Muhammad's work, in which she talks about the idea of us loving our students. It's really hard if I'm going to teach you if I don't genuinely love you. And that love comes from me valuing your voice in my classroom, valuing your experience, valuing all of yourself in the classroom, and making sure that that is a vehicle in which I am using to teach you, as well as to allow others in the classroom to learn from each other. And so I wanted to start off the conversation around just that thought of being able to teach students that we know, and that knowing comes in different forms. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on ways that we can still get to know our students even in this virtual space. um, so recently, I read the article by Rachel Gabriel, and it was posted in the Washington Post this year, and it was entitled, which of course here's a catchy title: "Can we stop telling the Corona kids how little they are learning?" This was definitely a great read as we think about this whole idea of what we or society believed as the students lost during this time. But this article really challenged us to look at it through another lens. Of course, we think of the negative words, such as using slide, lost, ways, pause, gap, and cliff to describe the learning. But the article also challenged us as educators to think about words such as welcome, wonder, if we acknowledge and appreciated the learning that they must have done. Think about this. While students were at home, they were spending more time looking out the window, probably out of boredom, but stopping and pausing long enough to observe. How many of you all picked up an extra hobby? I know for myself and my daughter, we decided we were going to make masks. Of course, that did not last very long, but we decided that we were going to make masks, and we together learned how to sew. I knew how to sew. I never really thought about teaching her how to sew, but just being able to spend time with her and teaching her how to sew. And so you think of all of the different things that students went through. Some were great, some were not so great, like dealing with loss, dealing with fear, dealing with anxiety, trying to manage their emotions, trying to navigate who was going to be on the television longer, allocating time with their siblings, or sometimes just stopping and playing some board games. And so there are different ways that students were able to learn in this place, even though it was not in a formal setting in the school walls. But the idea that the world is our classroom, as Sarah Ahmed talks about the world being our classroom, and just acknowledging that learning just does not happen within the four walls, but that it is life. And life teaches us a lot of lessons, and the skills and the things that we learn in the classroom help us to navigate through life. So I wanted to start by just sitting and pausing with this quote. And this is from the New Teacher Project. The achievement gap then isn't inevitable. It's baked into the system, resulting from the decisions adults make consciously and unconsciously about which students get what resources. It's a gap of our own design. And so, as we think about the idea of returning back to school for those that have returned or for those that are going to return shortly, what does that mean for us and our work? This the achievement gap, what does that mean for all students? Is that term an actual term that is equitable? Is that a term an actual term that is racist? And then it being baked into a system resulting from decisions that we have made or that we consciously and unconsciously make. Think about that. It's a gap of our own design, consciously and unconsciously. Well, I want to contrast the idea around the achievement gap with the work of Gloria Ladson Billings. She says the term racial achievement gap unfairly constructs students as defective and lacking, and admonishes them that they need to catch up. But rather, let's consider the term education debt, moving to a discourse that holds us all accountable. So as we go into this school year, how are we holding ourselves accountable? How are we being mindful of the things that we are choosing to engage students with? The opportunities, the topics that we are discussing with them, not looking at students as lagging going into the school year, but asking what value or what experiences would add to our learning, making the connection. This was a study done in 2017 by RAND. It's an analysis of where teachers got their resources from. And I always find this to be very interesting when we think about how social media or how the internet can be our friend, or it can actually be not so much of our friend and working against us and working against our students. As I look at this percentage, seeing that 96% of teachers use Google to find lessons and materials, and 75% of teachers use Pinterest to find lessons and materials, it makes me wonder, in the age of finding a quick fix or finding something quick to work with our students, are we actually looking through the resource that we're pulling from the internet through the lens of how it will add value, or how it will help to support, or how it will help our students think critically in the space that they're in or in my classroom? Will it be the concept, will it kind of support the concept of students completing a packet or a pre-made unit in which they are to work through? It might be fluffy, it might be great and fun, but is it actually adding to their learning? Is it actually helping them to process what it is that they've just experienced or that the world had experienced over the past few months and what they are continuing to experience? So I surveyed almost 100 students and I asked them two questions. The first question is how I feel when my teacher chooses my book. And so I really have been thinking a lot about the idea of um, like independent reading. And with independent reading, just students being able to choose a book. You know, it sounds like a very simple concept, but choosing a book of their own, that's redundant, choosing a book on their own. And I asked them how they feel when their teacher chooses a book. And here are some of the words that came out of my survey. So words like uninterested, frustrated, disappointed, like those types of things when students aren't able to kind of make choices. These are some of the ways that they are feeling because of those limitations. Now, of course, there are times where the book, or depending on the lesson, that you as the teacher would pull the book. But what opportunities are you giving students to really just make that connection, even in the quiet time? I think of, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but I'm thinking of Kwame Alexander's book, How to Read a Book, and just the way he spells out how to enjoy and just cherish the words in a book and just to curl up in all of those experiences. And words from the survey like uninterested, disappointed, and frustrated, all of those things prohibit students from actually enjoying a book of choice. But then in contrast, how do I feel when I choose my book? So you see the difference. Confident, interested, curious, happy. Very, very different story. And so allowing students to do that, to experience both. Sometimes as teachers, we choose books, but sometimes they're choosing books. But independent reading, really allowing them time to explore and just express themselves or experience or make connections with what the writer is writing, or even if they're not making personal connections, but to just see or read about different perspectives on different things. So now we think about what happens before learning. So I talked earlier about the start of the school year, and I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the um, three things I'm thinking about, just considering what is happening before, what is happening during instruction, and then what happens afterwards. So here's a quote from Sarah Ahmed, the author of Be the Change. Leave the, and I love this quote. Leave the inhumane practices in the Zoom waiting room. And so thinking about the practices that need to stay in the waiting room, there are some guiding questions that you as the teacher can think through. The first being, what opportunities are you providing during instruction to invite students into the learning space? Are expectations shared, or are they from one perspective? And then how are students able to connect their identity in the learning? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel valued? Do they feel just even comfortable enough to turn their camera on? Do you make them turn their camera on? Are their siblings allowed to sit next to them? Their grandmother allowed to stay there, stay next to them? And so all of those things, you think about just this, the concept of just beginning to start your Zoom class. What connections are, or I say Zoom, but I know everyone is not on Zoom, but just the video chat or the video recording so that you are connecting with your students. And then you have the during the learning session. So during learning, what is happening? And so I'm sorry, I'll go back to understanding that a package program does not grow students. This is a research that has been done from Cooperative Children's Book Center, and the most recent one was in 2018. And as you can see here, the lack of representation for all groups, all races, that there are more books about animals than there are about African Americans or Latinx or American Indians and Asian Pacific. So you see here what effects it has on students when they are actually seeing more books about them, or the lack thereof, the negative effects that it could have on them. Now, let me just say this, the work of Miss Hammond, Zarita Hammond, that she talks about just diversity in the classroom, and this idea that it is not solely about getting books that are diverse, but it is about actually using them as a tool and a vehicle to discuss issues of oppression, to read books about civil rights leaders and their people and leaders and people who worked against oppression, just using those as a vehicle. So you simply saying, yes, I have books that are diverse, that's not something that will start the conversation, but actually moving it a step further and using them as a vehicle. And so she has a beautiful, beautiful chart that she talks about it not being a continuum, but just different facets to consider when we are in the classroom. And so you have the multicultural education, social justice education, and culturally responsive education. And thinking about those three categories, they're all three important, but they serve different purposes. And so for our time together, I want to challenge you when you're thinking about multicultural education, that focuses on celebrating diversity, which is great. But when you move it a step further, you have social justice education, and that focuses on expressing the social political context that students experience. Now, lastly, culturally responsive education, when you're thinking about that is crucial. It focuses on improving the learning capacity of diverse students who have been marginalized educationally. And so this is that space that we want to transition to, being very culturally responsive in our education, making sure that we're not simply having books that are diverse, but we are using them as a tool to connect with our students, connect with their life, showing them, making connections to the world. There's a whole lot going on right now with injustice, police brutality, with racism, all of these things, along with COVID-19. All of these things are very traumatic in nature. And so it's very important that we think about the idea of culturally responsive education, so that as we are providing resources for students or choosing resources, that we are keeping that in mind. So here's a quote from Chad Everett, who was brilliant. He's a teacher and a consultant. It is both, when asked about what diversity means, he talks about this idea of it being quantitative and qualitative. and understanding that it's not so much about the number of books that you have, but it's really about what message each of those books are sending. What do they represent? I remember when my daughter was at a school, and we talked about having diversity of books. And I would continuously say to the school, as a family of color, that if we only talk about African Americans um, during Black History Month, then the idea of oppression, the idea of suffrage, the idea of having to overcome obstacles becomes, subconsciously associated with African Americans. And I know that in my life, I don't just deal with oppression. I just don't deal with suffrage. I don't just deal with obstacles. Now, of course, as a family of color, that is a part of my reality, but that is not the only thing. I deal with family traditions. I deal with spending quality time with my children and my husband. I deal with all of making memories, going on trips, going on cruises, all of these things that encompass who we are as an individual, all of those things. So we have to be careful of the message, the subconscious message that we are sending when we're choosing particular books. So here are some guiding questions that I want you to think about when we are, during instruction. In what areas have you seen success in your instructional practice, and what strategies work? What are some indicators that could help to determine if a resource is improving a student's performance? And then lastly, what opportunities allow for continuous two-way feedback from students? And thinking of students, ELL students, students with IEPs, only children in the household, older siblings, etc. Those are all of the things that you should be thinking about. Students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This is one of my favorite quotes from the late Rita Pearson. And so after you have finished your session, are you still trying to make a connection? Or for students that, for whatever reason, connectivity issues, a lack of devices, or just health reasons, how are you still then connecting with your students afterwards? So the questions that come up: what opportunities are we allowing for students' two worlds to meet, school and life? What an awesome opportunity we have to peek into students' home. We are invited guests. It kind of makes my blood boil when I think about the idea of forcing students to turn on their camera. Understand that we are a guest in students' homes, and we have to be invited into their home. And so there are certain situations in which students don't want to turn on their camera. It could be because of shame, it could be because of what is going on behind them. But we have to be very careful when we force students to stick into these systems or policies that we've created that don't connect to the humanity of our students. And then how are you keeping it simple and consistent with families? No assumptions and biases. And in what ways are you making students' social well-being a priority? And so I end with this quote from Chinkos and Whitehurst. Instructional materials exercise their influence on learning directly, as well as influence teachers' instructional choices and behaviors, which makes instructional materials all the more important. Thinking about instructional materials, but taking it further, not just instructional materials, strategies, opportunities, all of those things. What type of environment are you setting up for your students to feel valued, feel loved, and to feel a part of the learning process? Simply giving assignments and asking students to complete it and turn it in is not engagement. It's not learning. But I know that we have limitations in certain spaces. But we want to make sure that first and foremost that we are connecting with our students. So I wanted to leave you with some of the books that help to inform my work. There are so many more. I didn't have enough space on the slide to go through all of the wonderful resources that are out there. But here are a few that helped me with my thinking around the idea of connecting with our students, the humanity in our students, and not just only teaching them, but connecting with them to then allow them to experience the learning. Here are some ways that you can connect with me on social media. On Facebook, I am at Harris Innovation. On Instagram, I am at Harris Innovation CG. And then on Twitter, I am at Dr. T. Harris. Thank you so much for your time and attention during this time. And I hope that you all have an awesome, awesome, awesome school year. Happy teaching.